And we all know that seafood safety is an important issue to the consuming public, but scientists at Southern Miss are looking at long-term considerations that impact the overall health of the Gulf environment. Let's turn our scientists here today to discuss more about that impact. Dr. Thomas.
Good. Thank you, Aaron. We're happy to welcome today Harriet Perry, who's the director of the Fisheries Center at the Gulf Coast Research Lab, and Jim Franks, who's a fisheries biologist and a senior research scientist at GCRL as well. Good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Let's begin. Harriet, if you would give us a little overview of your lab's work.
I work in fisheries, and one of the things, of course, we're concerned about with the spill is the impact on distribution and abundance of commercially important and ecologically important species. And we have monitored for the past 37 plus years, and we really stepped up our monitoring efforts when the spill happened. And it will take us probably a year before we can really evaluate the impact of the spill on distribution and abundance, because different organisms have different seasonalities, but we feel very confident that within a year that we will be able to look at changes and to assess the impacts.
Jim.
Yes, well, of course, Harriet and I have worked together for many years at the laboratory, and she mentioned species of fishes, invertebrates of commercial value. Of course, many of those are also of recreational value. You have a very important, a very large recreational fishing industry on the coast. It has been impacted by the spill, of course, in many ways. A lot of those species, those fish, are extremely important in that industry, and we have great concerns for those as well. Various life history stages of those, both in the estuary and offshore, are of very high interest to us at this point, and we are in the process of conducting a number of studies to examine potential impacts to those fishery resources.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's important for the audience to understand that y'all have been at this a long time. You said that, you know, your labs have tons and tons of data, a good baseline to spring forward with. Based on that information, and now looking ahead at this oil spill and what it's done, what's happened in the Gulf of Mexico, what are you anticipating? What are you thinking may happen what are your concerns about what may be happening to the fisheries, and is there anything that you've seen so far?
I think our initial concern when the oil spill first hit it was such a horrific environmental catastrophe. Are we going to see fishery failure? Are we actually going to experience what other estuaries and coastal ecosystems have experienced? Or will there be no effect, or at best, if there is going to be an effect, will it just be a diminished year class? And as we have sampled over the 4 months or 5 months since the spill, it appears to us that we're going to probably be looking at perhaps a diminished year class type of scenario as opposed to any kind of catastrophic fishery failure. And that's very encouraging. Mm-hmm. One of the things that's important to understand about Mississippi fisheries is that most of them are estuarine dependent, which means that they spend their larval life history offshore, and they use our coastal wetlands to grow and to mature. And even if oil had never hit Mississippi, it would still have been possible to have an impact on our fisheries because of the offshore larval stage of many of our important fishes and invertebrates. So when the spill happened, those animals and organisms that spawn in the spring, their larvae were offshore. And we estimate about 40% of the larval grounds were covered with oil. And so I am currently monitoring blue crabs very heavily because their larvae were offshore, and they will continue to be offshore until probably October when they cease spawning. So I will have accumulated probably almost 2,500 samples that we will be going through this year just on blue crab settlement.
Mm.
As a follow-up to that, of course, shortly after the spill, I was involved in a research cruise offshore. We were focusing on the young of the big offshore species, the tunas, and some of the billfishes. We were able to collect a number of samples in the southern Gulf and up in the northern Gulf within an area that had been impacted by the spill. In fact, we collected some of our samples under the oil sheen. And so we're actually processing those samples now just to, first of all, to see what's there. Particularly interested in the giant bluefin tuna larvae. This is a very special fish that spawns in the Gulf of Mexico. Its peak spawning season is April and May, and historically our samples have come from the region near where the spill occurred. So there's great concern for that species, and so our sample analyses continue to see what we actually have found in our rather large number of samples. That's an ongoing process. And I did bring back some of those samples, of course, for our toxicologist. Hopefully someday he'll be able to examine those as well from a tox point of view to see maybe what some of those impacts from the spill had upon those species. So both inshore and offshore, there's this linkage. You know, the offshore spawning, the early life stages, later on many of those species coming into our estuary and actually form the basis of our seafood industry. But in the case of those large pelagic fishes, those fish do remain offshore. And although the adults might have been able to avoid the spill, once they spawn, their eggs and larvae are passively drifting at the surface in currents, and we were concerned that a number of those may have been transported into the spilled area. So those are quite important concerns, I think, for us at this point.
Yeah. Well, you know, y'all have made the point that there are just so many elements of the biology of these critters that you have to study, and you have to gather information on the impact of the dispersants in the oil. You've got decades of information out there. I'm interested in two things. Do you just keep doing the same things but start to apply it to the effects of the oil spill? And at what point do you think you can start to come out with information on what kind of a timeline?
For my group, we're actually ramping up sampling. We want to do a better job of sampling the early life history stages, and that would be the stage that moves from offshore inshore. So we use a variety of different kinds of gear depending on the size of the animal that we're after. So for those early life history stages, it's very time consuming, and it's very time consuming to pick the samples. And so we have indicator stations, but we hope with funding to be able to really spatially broaden our sampling area and the number of samples that we can do so that we do adequately address settlement issues.
Yeah, I think Harriet and I are in the same boat on that one, no pun intended. But we do intend to go offshore and to do some advanced studies inshore, in hopefully in the next week or two, to go back in those areas where we had previously sampled before the spill, and some of those samples were taken during the spill. To go back and look at those areas, get some new samples, and to again assess those and see if we can determine some impacts based on what's happening right now.
Yeah. Are there any preliminary results you could discuss? And it's okay to qualify it, but please explain to the audience why you would qualify it.
Could I add a little something to what Jim
Please.
said that I think is an exciting area of research that the laboratory has conducted in past years? We will be taking a cruise to look at the deep water ecosystem of the deep sea crabs, and our laboratory along with the University of South Florida and the University of Florida in the 1980s and 90s did an extensive study, and one of our study sites was very close to the wellhead, and so we're going to revisit those sites, and this is very deep water, about 450 to 500 fathoms, and we will be retrapping to look at impacts of the spill on those deep water organisms.
And on that same cruise, I'm going to be, along with our team, our large pelagics team, examining the composition, the species richness, the numbers of species, the distribution and abundance of fishes and invertebrates that reside in a drifting habitat known as sargassum. It's a pretty spectacular surface habitat. It's a form of algae that's a spectacular plant that covers vast areas of the Gulf and is really one of the major habitats for the early life stages of many of our offshore species. And of course, we have encountered that in quite heavily oil conditions over the last few months, and we're concerned about the impact and the insult to that specific habitat and its inhabitants. So we'll be examining that as well. And many of those fishes are later grow up. Those young fish later grow up to become the base of a number of our commercial and recreational fishes. So we're very interested in assessing those impacts as best we can.
Yeah. I remember, Harriet, a preliminary interview that you did where you talked about that y'all had found the evidence of oil in the larval blue crabs, and the media picked that up and ran with it, and I think maybe went a bit far, the scientific community would say. What did that mean to you, and what you countered that?
Somehow it got wrapped up in the seafood safety issue, and there is a difference in being fit for consumption and being biologically fit. And while a fish, the flesh may be fine to eat, and all of the tests, whether they're federal or state tests, have come back that the seafood is safe, is not the same as saying an organism is biologically fit, in that there may be, from chronic exposure, you might see changes in their reproductive capacity or changes in growth, and those are important fishery issues. We certainly don't want to be selecting for small size and have reproduction curtailed. So I think it's important that the public understand the difference in those two. And we were concerned with, from an ecological standpoint, in finding those small droplets. And we are still working on that research with several other laboratories to try to understand what we are seeing. And it's going to take some real funding to help us with analytical cost. We've been kind of doing it on a shoestring budget, but we are continuing to monitor and to send samples out for analysis.
Right. Yeah, that complicates discussion in the lab, doesn't it? On that same article, I was interviewed and I talked about bioaccumulation, but I was talking about in the whole ecosystem of how this oil can move up, and people took that to mean that all of a sudden adult crabs would be full of oil.
Right.
And we didn't mean that at all, so that's a real concern. But that leads to the next question, and I'll address Harriet here, but Jim, if you jump in. There's been a little controversy here about how much oil is left in the Gulf. You know, we heard NOAA make a pronouncement, and a lot of us think that was misconstrued. It sounded like that only 26% was left, whereas reality, a lot of it was dispersed and the like. Then a group from the University of Georgia came out with some information. CNN covered a group from South Florida, and then a group from Woods Hole came in. What does that say about that discussion about the difficulty in understanding the process of science?
It is difficult for lay people to understand the process of science. And one of the important things for us as researchers is to feel free to discuss our findings with our colleagues and with others without fear of being misinterpreted in the media or ridiculed. And it's been a very difficult working environment in the Gulf with that issue. Science is a process, and it's going to take a long time to answer these questions, and some of them are not going to play out for maybe a decade or so. And so we have to be patient, and we have to encourage that kind of science and research that will give us the answers that we need. But it's a process, and I think those two groups are going to have to work together to see who is right. And
right. Well, and the reality is they're not saying that the other one's wrong. They're just saying here's what we found.
Right.
And so over time it all
Right.
kind of incrementally builds.